I'm so honored to be here today to talk to my friend Ann White. And I have the privilege of being your friend, but I also want the audience to know that you are a speaker, an author, a television host, and the founder of a ministry, IGM. And I also know that you have just poured so many of your life experiences into a new book that you've written called The 7 Steps to Courage. Can you tell us your personal story?
Yeah, Trudy, it was about 4 years ago, and God got me to a place in my life where for years I'd been operating in fear, really. I think many of us do that often. You know, we'll allow fear to just completely take hold of our life. And I'd gotten to a point where I just couldn't do it anymore. And so God allowed me to get to that point. It was a breaking point in my life. And I needed the courage to make a change in my life, to come out and do something different, to come out and be the person that God had designed me to be. But in order to do that, I had to go through a process throughout about a 2.5-year period. And really the book is all about that process. It's about the process of going from fear to faith. It's about going from operating in kind of reaction mode.
Like we all do so much of.
We do, and it's a tendency. We live in that fast-paced lifestyle, and we just kind of go through the motions. But to going to intentionally, courageously making choices that are healthy and that will impact our relationships, that will nurture our relationships, that will nurture us as people.
Well, that's what I love so much about the book. It's not just your personal story, but it's also great sound advice. And it's the way you've laid it out through the 7 steps. Tell me about how the word courage is an acrostic, and you've given 7 steps, 7 action steps for the readers to take to apply to their own personal life.
Sure. You know, in the book, I am very careful to lay out the steps that I went through. And the word courage just seemed to fit, you know, as I began to think about how am I going to express to readers and to audiences the steps that I had to go through. Because I went through a lot of counseling. My husband and I both did. We spent 2.5 years in kind of intensive counseling. We had allowed over 33 years together to culminate into this very dysfunctional, very unhealthy relationship that we just kind of painted up and made really look good on the outside, but that was just kind of crumbling on the inside. And so I really had to figure out for audiences and people that I'm speaking to, how can I relate this information? You know, because they may want to walk through some of those same steps. There's a way we build our courage muscles. There's a way we build our courage muscles, and it's just that we continue to implement it on a day-to-day basis. You know, I'm still working on implementing courage every single day in everything that God has me do.
I love how you have one statement in the book that you say, replace fear with faith.
Yes.
And also, I feel, Anne, that the book, yes, it will help anyone in a marriage, but it'll also help anyone who's really needing to step out, maybe break free from other issues that they have in their life. I really feel like you have taken what you've experienced and just put it in writing in a way that anyone that reads your book will come out more empowered to do or to get through to the next point in their life, whatever it is that they just need a guide, a roadmap for. I really feel like your book does that.
You're right. And courage looks different for everybody else. You know, courage for you was surviving cancer, you know, and going through that whole process. And courage for me was surviving a broken marriage and learning how to come out and be transparent and vulnerable and really tell someone for the first time. Courage for someone else might be a job change, a career change. It might be standing up to someone who's hurt you and you're in conflict with. It can be all sorts of things.
Or even something positive. You know, courage.
Absolutely.
It takes courage to do really positive things.
Absolutely.
And I like how the book has a lot of really good graphics and action plans, and even has a linear chart of healthy emotions, positive emotions, and what then are the negative emotions, because we all go through that, whether it's, you know, surviving something huge or just trying to step out in faith for the plan that God has for our life.
Definitely. There's charts and graphs through here that I've worked through with a counselor, the counselor that worked with Mike and I through our crisis and helped us to repair a damaged relationship.
Yes.
And so you mentioned the acrostic, okay, and it was very important because as I went back and I thought about, how can I explain these steps of courage? It just seemed to make sense that I would start with the letters of courage. So the C step in courage is commit to change, because the very first thing that we have to do when we want to be courageous and make a change in our life, when God's speaking to us and telling us, you're not where I need you to be, you really need to be somewhere else, then we need to commit to that change. Once we've committed that change, there's obstacles that we've got to overcome, and that comes into the O step. Overcome those obstacles. We all have them. They could be multiples of different things, and I go in the book, I'll talk about all sorts of different obstacles. I'll give probably the top 10, but it really gives you practical advice and steps you can take to overcome any obstacle you have in your life. And then you go to the U step. Now that's uncover the real you. That was a big thing for me. Often we go through life trying to be something that we think other people want us to be, or that we even think we're supposed to be. And God really made us to be who we are and how He sees us. And that can give us so much, comfort and peace, and allow us to have courage to go and do the things that He would like for us to do, or that He has opened doors for us, if we can just embrace who we really are and be comfortable in our own skin. So then the R step is replace worldly lies, which we have a lot of, with scriptural truth. God's put it all right there in His Word. He's given us the truth of who we are, the truth of where we're going, the truth of what He has for us, what He desires for us, and how much He loves us. And if we can really replace the worldly lies that we've adopted, which we all do in childhood,
and we run them through our head like a ticker tape.
Satan uses them. We have this internal judge, and I talk about that in the book, how the internal judge that we have just beats us over the head all the time, saying, you're not good enough to do this. Why would you think you can do this? I had those voices that continued to drive me down and discourage me. Or, in my case, when I kept myself in isolation, I had those voices telling me, you can't tell anybody that your marriage is struggling. What are they going to think? Are they going to judge you? And so, or you're going to ruin your reputation. You're going to ruin your husband's reputation. When you finally come out and you lay it on the table, we all have a mess. We all have issues and we all have problems. And if we're just transparent about it, we can make one another feel comfortable with where we are. And we can support one another as God would tell us. So I'll get back to the steps, okay? We were at the R step. And now we've got the A, which is a real important step, and it certainly was for me. Accept the things you cannot change. There's some things in our life and in our circumstances that we can't change. We may not be able to change where we're living at the moment. We may not be able to change who our kids are and how they act. There are things we can change, though. If we're in an unhealthy job, or we're in an unhealthy relationship that's physically or emotionally abusive, I talk a lot about that in here. How do we make those courageous changes that we can make, and how do we accept the ones that we can't change? Now, one thing that you and I've learned, there's one person in this relationship that we can change, right? It's us.
And not to keep the focus on the other person and what they need to change, but the power you have is to change yourself.
Exactly.
And I love that you bring that out.
Exactly. I had to realize that. We go through life, and especially as a codependent, and that was my story for many, many years, and I still am. But I know how to deal with that. I recognize the issues that I've struggled with out of childhood, and I know how to courageously face them when those old habits want to come back in. But I had to change me. I was constantly thinking I could change my husband, change my kids, change my surroundings, change my circumstances, and fix everything around me, and then that would be okay. When in reality, I needed to fix me.
And that's really controlling, when we're trying to control everything outside of us. And realizing we cannot control that because we are not God.
Right. So we just accept those. All right, now the G. That comes into grasping God's love for us. We can sit there and say, we understand how God loves us, but I began studying His Word, really studying His Word. When I was saved at 19, I didn't I carried my Bible to church. That was about the extent of it. And about 15 years ago, I began to really study His Word and then began to teach it. And as I did, I really got to know who He is. And we talk about a personal relationship with Christ,
Right.
but many of us just haven't gotten there yet. And then it's a work in progress. It's a relationship. It always takes work, right? So, but I got to know God.
Yes.
And I got to a point, and really throughout this crisis, because sometimes it takes a crisis to drive us into the
Get our
arms of the
attention.
Lord. Yeah. And it brings us closer. So I really began to understand how much He loves me, how He doesn't condemn me
Right.
for what I've done in the past, you know, or even where I'm at, or the mistakes I'm going to make tomorrow, because I'm going to make them no matter what.
Yeah, and that's why it's called the Word, because it is God's Word to us, Him
Absolutely.
speaking to us through His Word.
Absolutely.
So there is power in that.
And the last step is the E step, which is embrace a life of grace. You know, we talk about God's grace for us, but we have grace for other people.
Yes. we
So
do.
often, okay, someone has really hurt me, and then the forgiveness is a whole other thing, and I do deal with that in the book as well, because it's an important component. But that grace component is being able to say, God graciously forgives me for everything I've ever done.
Right.
And He's got enough grace for me and the people around me. And then, so it's about receiving that grace, but also giving that grace.
Exactly. And you know, like you say, we give grace to so many people, but it's so hard, I think, to give grace to ourselves. You know, we want to keep holding ourselves accountable and, you know, talking to ourselves negatively. But you're right. If God doesn't condemn us, then why do we want to keep doing that to ourselves?
Yeah, we definitely do very, very often.
And I love every bit about that, but I also love the two last chapters, you know, and how you talk about joy and the importance of joy in that. So as we wrap up, you want to talk about the joy that you've experienced since you worked through those
Sure.
7 steps.
Yeah, finding joy in the journey. We can have joy all the way along the
Yes.
way. Now, we're going to have hard times. And trust me, there were days that I just looked at God and I said, Lord, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can deal with the pain and the process of going back and dealing with those memories and those problems and issues that I developed as a child that had me just really stuck. I'd stuffed them in the recesses of my soul and just kind of pushed them aside in order to go on.
Yeah.
They needed to come back out. And sometimes that's a painful process. But as you do, you've got to intentionally embrace joy.
Yes.
And you realize that down the road, this is all going to make a difference. You're going to get to where God really wants you to be. And then as you begin to embrace this newfound courage, God is going to open up doors that's going to amaze you. You may not start a ministry. God wanted me to birth a ministry, and I looked at Him and I said, Lord, what are you talking about? You know, I can barely stand up in front of a crowd of a few people. You know, I'm teaching Sunday school. But He had bigger plans for me. And so when I committed to Him, and I talk about a story in here where He told me one day that I would be His spokesperson. Now that was well over 15 years ago.
The waiting.
But I knew it, and He needed to get me to this place. So grab joy while you're there. Keep it all the way through the process. It's an intentional, just like having courage and implementing courage is an intentional choice for every single one of us.
So in the last few minutes that we have, what would be one thought you want to leave the viewers with about your book and encourage them to go out and get this book?
Yeah, well, you know, I think the one thought is courage is for everybody. You know, courage is about taking a risk, not knowing the outcome, trusting God with the outcome, because every single day, we don't know many times what we're going to face in that particular day. We can be thrown a curveball in a moment's time.
So true.
But if we've exercised our courage muscles, and that's why this
love that.
book, I believe, is so important, because courage is not something that you pick up and you put on that's an immediate process. Courage is something that we continue to exercise, and we build up those muscles, and then we have it when we deal with difficult things, which we're all going to do. So I would just encourage people to come through. You mentioned the charts. There's numbers of charts in here. that talk about the obstacles we face and overcoming. There's resources in here. There's recommendations of other books that I read
Yes,
as I was
that
going
helps.
through the process. So this is a great self-help book to gain courage to deal with any difficult life situation that you're going through, or if you just want to read my story, because I really implement the story of where I came to that crashing point in Israel and then take you all the way through to where God has restored and healed a lot of things in my life today.
It's so exciting, and thank you so much
Thank
for sharing
you.
that. And can't wait to see what God does with it, with all these great things.
Me either. I'm ready. Thanks so much, Trudy.
Thank you.